Welcome back to Two Broads Talking Politics. As usual, I'm one of your hosts, Sophie, and I'm here with your other host, Kelly. Hey, Kelly.
Hello, everybody.
Today's episode is all about gender identity. So we have with us for this first segment, Molly Woodstock. She's the host of Gender Reveal, a podcast all about essential gender concepts and interviewing trans people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Welcome.
Thanks. I don't want to start the episode on the biggest downer, but you did just misgender me, so I actually use they them pronouns.
I'm so sorry.
It's
I'm
okay.
so sorry. You use they?
Yeah, it's great. It's a learning moment for us all to start the show with.
I apologize. I'm so sorry.
Mm-hmm. It's okay.
I'm really sorry about that.
All right, so we should start. We never do this, but we should. So I should say that I, Kelly, use she and her.
And I, Sophie, also use she and her.
Great.
So welcome to our show.
Thank you.
I'm hoping that some of our listeners will go on over and check out Gender Reveal as well. So let's just sort of start off basically. We have some listeners who don't really know a lot about gender and maybe don't know any out trans people. Let's sort of just start talking about what the difference is between sex and gender.
So biological sex is a designation that everyone is given by a doctor when they're born based on their external genitalia. So when you're born, a doctor looks down, and depending on what they see, they'll say it's a boy or it's a girl, and they'll put that on your birth certificate, and that is your sex that you're assigned. Whereas gender is entirely based on social and cultural constructions and norms based on what we perceive to be masculine and feminine. And so what's considered to be biological sex, male and female, is pretty standard across cultures. How we perceive gender is really different compared to where we are in the world and also when we are, right? Because our norms for what's considered masculine and feminine has changed over time, just in America in the last 100 years, right? So gender is much more socially constructed, but just because it's a social construct, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have very real impact to everyone, right? So.
Yeah, and so I just today was talking to someone who was talking about parties that, and this is kind of totally bizarre, but these so-called gender reveal parties that people do while they're pregnant. And apparently there's some restaurant near my parents' house where instead of having a cake that you cut into and is maybe blue or pink, instead you give it to the cooks, the little slip that says boy or girl. And if they give you boneless chicken wings, it's a girl, and if they give you bone-in chicken wings, it's a boy.
What?
So, I mean, I've got a million problems with this, of course, but to sort of give the basic problem is just it's not a gender reveal party, right? It's a sex reveal party.
And I also like to mention when we're talking about this kind of thing that not only is gender not binary, but sex actually isn't binary because about 1% of folks are born intersex, which means that they don't present as what we traditionally think of biologically male or female, maybe their internal genitalia doesn't match their external genitalia in ways that we expect, or maybe they have a different chromosome combination like XXY, for example. And so I just think it's really important to point out that not only could your gender not match your sex assigned at birth, but your sex assigned at birth might not actually match the experience in your body either.
I'm going to say, I don't think there's a lot of popular culture that addresses that, but there is a novel by Jeffrey Eugenides called Middlesex that I love. I really love that book that talks about the experience of a person. Is it just one? So it's a whole several generations of a family that have a gene mutation. And it's a really interesting book. So it's one of the rare points of pop culture I can think that actually addresses that.
One thing I think would be good for us to talk about, I think some of our listeners think the experience of being transgender as you are born, say, with a penis, but your gender is a woman. But there are people who are non-binary or gender non-conforming who don't necessarily identify as either a man or woman, or who identify as both. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to be non-binary or gender non-conforming, and sort of what that experience is like?
Yeah, definitely. So non-binary transgender is the concept of not feeling strictly male or strictly female all of the time. And so that can look hundreds of different ways. And non-binary isn't so much a gender as it is an umbrella term for every other gender that's not strictly male or strictly female. So there are folks who identify as agender, which means no gender at all. There are folks who use terms like demi-boy or demi-girl. They might use trans-masculine or trans-feminine. They might use bigender or trigender, or there's like Native American terms like two-spirits, and lots of other cultures around the world that have non-binary representation in their like native culture. The gender queer is another term that's often used synonymously with non-binary. There's also gender fluid. And so there's really all of these expressions. And like you said, it could mean that you identify with more than one gender. It means you could identify with no gender. It means that you could move fluidly through the genders. Or it could just mean that you aren't sure what you feel, but you're pretty sure that it's not strictly male or strictly female. And so you move to a non-binary space. And there are so many reasons. That's something that I explore in my podcast all the time, is the many, many, many ways that non-binary identity presents itself in different folks' life. Like some people say that, you know, their gender is informed by their race. It might be informed by their blackness, or it's informed by their fatness, maybe. It could be informed by all sorts of different things. And so it's really just a catch-all term for not identifying as strictly male or strictly female.
And so I think this is one of the things that's hardest for people to understand often, especially if they don't have any personal experience with someone in their lives who is non-binary in some way. And so, I was talking to my parents trying to explain some of what this episode was going to be about, and they didn't have any trouble understanding the concept of transgender, meaning, a biological man who decides to live as a woman or vice versa. That they seemed perfectly comfortable with. I don't know that they know any out trans people who present that way, but at least they sort of understood the concept. But they just could not understand the concept of gender non-binary or gender fluid or any of these. And I think that that's one of the things that society, even as it's becoming maybe slightly more accepting of trans in general, is still really struggling to figure out ways to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the youth are leading the charge on this. Like, the majority of folks who identify as non-binary or genderqueer are in their either teens or 20s. And I think that part of it is just a sign that folks are tired of conforming to the gender roles that exist in society, right? Because like one of the greatest and biggest things about being non-binary is you're released from the gendered expectations of society. You're released from the gendered roles that are, what a typical man should look like and what a typical woman should look like, because you're not identifying as either of those roles. And like, we can have a big discussion about all of the incredible men and women who identify as men and women, but they do a great job, sort of subverting what those identities look like. And so I'm not trying to say that if you play with gender norms, you can't identify as a man or a woman, but I think that that is one of the most amazing and freeing and liberating things about being non-binary, is you get to let go of the feeling of like, oh, should I be shaving my legs? Oh, should I be wearing more makeup? Oh, should I be behaving in this way and presenting myself in this way? And you get to just like do what comes naturally to you. And what comes naturally to you might be a mixture of what we consider masculine and feminine, because that's how a lot of us are. So I think it's really hard for older generations who never questioned, I don't want to say never questioned, but who never saw people who outwardly rejected those two options as the only two options. I think it's really hard to wrap your mind around. Whereas kids who grow up surrounded by non-binary and trans kids, it's much easier for them to consider a world in which folks are rejecting both of those labels.
So I am a university administrator, and our systems are set up reasonably well to accommodate people who are completely either trans presenting or have transitioned, but our systems are still very binary. So we may have a separate place to list your, whether you want to go by Ms. or Mr. or Miss or Doctor or whatever, versus what you've listed as your sex. But we're not very well equipped for things like genderqueer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's one of the things that, as administrators, even when you really want to be accommodating and sort of want to do the best you can, it's often very difficult to figure out how to work these into systems that are already in place. And so I think that that extends not just beyond, a university where we can sort of find workarounds and find ways to deal with that, but extends into government and politics and
Mm-hmm.
how a person interacts with society largely.
Mm-hmm.
And so things like birth certificates or driver's licenses, even if those systems can figure out ways fairly easily to say, well, it doesn't have to be the biological sex that you were born with, it's much more difficult often for them to figure out ways to accommodate genderqueer. So,
Mm-hmm.
are there places where that is being worked on? Not even necessarily in the US, but are there places where government is being proactive in thinking about these sorts of issues, and how can we, within the systems that are in place, and sometimes you have to have a system, right? You have to have some sort of identification, so are there places where that is sort of being worked on or pushed to the forefront a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to start really quickly by mentioning that with regards to forms, like something that's a really cool thing for allies to do is that anytime you see a form that's not accommodating gender non-binary folks, is to bring it to the attention of the person who made it and ask it to be changed. Anytime I see a form that only has 2 gender options, I email the person who sent it to me and ask them to change it, and at least half the time they do, and they can. So that's not the case in all systems, obviously, but I think it's worth asking. More broadly, in terms of gender, there are several countries that do recognize like other third genders. That includes Australia, Canada, Germany, India, and Nepal, among others. So that's definitely happening in other countries. And there are places where you can get an X on your passport, for example,
Mm.
and to signify neither male nor female. Also in the United States, the entire West Coast of the country now allows folks to get an X on their driver's license instead of male or female. And not only that, you aren't required to get doctor's notes and surgeries the way that you once were. In a lot of states, you're required to have like really invasive medical surgeries before you're allowed to switch your gender marker on documents. But now in Washington, Oregon, and California, you can change I think it's your birth certificate and your driver's license at this point. Everything's moving really fast, so it's hard to keep track. But I believe that for both birth certificates and driver's licenses, you can now switch your documents to an X, which is great until you need to go to a part of the country that's not those 3 states.
Yeah.
And then it's, because in other countries or in other states rather, like you definitely can't change your license to indicate that you're non-binary. You can barely do it to switch your gender if you're a binary trans person. The other thing that I want to push back on when we're talking about this, because it really is great that so many countries and states are introducing non-binary options. But the thing I want to push back on is, why do we list our gender on so many things? It's completely irrelevant most of the time. My gender has nothing to do with how well I can drive a car, so why is it on my driver's license? I understand in certain situations it might be relevant, but in most cases there's no need for folks to ask for my gender. So I just won't fill it in unless it's required, So I think that's something we need to question too, is like why we're collecting so much data on gender in the first place and whether it's actually necessary.
So another thing I would like to ask a little bit about